Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 7 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After which, we're going to talk about my top 36 running back rankings. Remember, there are 6 teams on bye: the Carolina Panthers, the Cincinnati Bengals, Dallas Cowboys, Houston Texans, New York Jets, and Tennessee Titans. That's 8 running backs off the top of my head that I honestly believe should have been in this top 36 rankings if they weren't on bye week. So the running back position gets relatively thin very quickly. So as we progress throughout today's video, I share with you guys my thought process and opinions regarding these running backs, present statistics in order to justify their rankings. Hopefully it gives you guys as much information as possible so that you can make the most confident decisions going into week 7 so that we can all capture victories. Don't forget, there are timestamps down in the description of the video for those of you who are looking for a specific player. And also, rankings are always subject to change. Between now and Sunday, there can be a lot of injury information and news made available to the public that can certainly adjust these rankings overall, so keep that in mind. For those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings and of course content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So if you've yet to do so, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are very close to reaching our goal of 80,000 subscribers. Thank you very much for the support. Okay, let's get into talking about running back matchups at the position. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 running back rushing statistics allowed. Like I've mentioned in the past, we only isolate rushing statistics because the biggest determining factor as to whether or not a running back has an advantageous matchup is based on rushing statistics alone, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Their overall upside of getting receiving statistics isn't based on matchups, rather the offensive coordinator and the quarterback's tendencies to get them incorporated within the receiving game. Therefore, we find the following. The Carolina Panthers are at the top of the conversation along with the Denver Broncos in terms of giving up the most fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated to opposing running backs thus far this season. Obviously, their incredible yard per carry averages that they're allowing, the volume of rushing touchdowns they're allowing has really become the difference maker as to why we want to continue to start our running backs in these given matchups. Obviously, Raheem Mostert had himself an incredible week against the Carolina Panthers, but no one will be playing against the Carolina Panthers as they're on bye week. Nonetheless, I wanted to go ahead and present these statistics to you guys so that you have an understanding as to the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video in regards to the running back position, but I also wanted to go ahead and present some of the more difficult matchups at the running back position. The Detroit Lions are now the toughest matchup at the running back position. They have given up very few fantasy points to opposing running backs and obviously very few touchdowns. In terms of teams and their tendencies of running the ball against the Detroit Lions, based on the fact that that offense has been playing incredibly well, it often forces opposing offenses to have to pass for majority of the time. So obviously the overall upside of rushing statistics isn't there. But either way, when teams try to run the ball on the Detroit Lions, a 3.08 yard per carry average certainly gives you an understanding as to what we're dealing with. Either way, the New Orleans Saints, Philadelphia Eagles, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Browns, the Jaguars, a lot of these incredible teams in terms of stopping the run are going to continue to be as great as they've been thus far. So we'll keep an eye on that in regard to some of our running backs. Now, with that all mentioned, let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 36 running back rankings. Do not forget, like I mentioned earlier, besides subscribing to the channel to stay up to date on my latest content, you can also travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $500, again, that's in a limited time basis, but you're also going to get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, top 100 flex, half PPR, full PPR rankings that are never offered on this channel in terms of content, now expansively there. So for those of you who want rankings for the remainder of the season every single Sunday morning to have an advantage upon your league mates, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew, draft some teams via best ball. Of course, put together some pick'em slips like we've been doing over the course of this season. If you're wondering if you're eligible, the map on the right side of the screen determines your eligibility based on your current location. Thank you very much for the support. Use code Andrew. Thank you. All right, let's get into the conversation of our top 36 running back rankings. We begin with Christian McCaffrey as our number 1, and he has a little asterisk next to the number 1, primarily because I don't know if Christian McCaffrey is going to play. He plays on Monday Night Football against the Minnesota Vikings, and that certainly makes it that much more difficult as to predicting whether or not he's going to play. Sure, he gets an additional day of rest prior to the game, but at the same time, if you don't have Jordan Mason or Elijah Mitchell on your team going into Monday Night Football, you may not have an opportunity to go ahead and start Christian McCaffrey confidently because we won't know whether or not he's going to be an active participant in that game. Obviously, the oblique injury that he sustained Hopefully he's not going to knock him out for this upcoming week and that he's going to be active. And if he is, obviously he's my number one running back as we're starting Christian McCaffrey in all overall opportunities, regardless of whether he'll be limited in the game. He's a set it and forget it kind of running back. Therefore, hopefully you can go ahead and pick up either Jordan Mason or Elijah Mitchell tonight via waiver wire so that you can go ahead and have an opportunity to at least have a piece of this backfield just in case going into Monday night's game against the Minnesota Vikings, Christian McCaffrey does not play. You'll have a backup option for insurance purposes. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about our actual number one for the week, assuming that Christian McCaffrey maybe doesn't play this week. We have Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler is coming off of a very disappointing performance last night. And altogether, the Los Angeles Chargers offense was quite disappointing. So was the Dallas Cowboys. To be honest, when you go ahead and look at the entirety of week 6, amongst all games in the 30 teams that played, only 5 teams in the National Football League scored more than 21 points in their games. That is a ridiculously low number. On top of it, if you look at weeks 1 through 6 thus far this season, compared to weeks 1 through 6 all the way back to 2011, the red zone success rate of offenses this season is at an all-time low since 2011. An unbelievable statistic to say the very least. But obviously, as of late, offenses have not been playing well. But hopefully we can get back on track. And especially Austin Ekeler coming back from an injury yesterday, he still had a high volume of opportunity. 20 total opportunities, 18 total touches. And going into this upcoming weekend's game against the Kansas City Chiefs, the expectation is that we should see the normal Austin Ekeler that we typically do. Throughout the last 9 games in his career that he has taken on the Kansas City Chiefs, he has scored a base minimum of 13 fantasy points in every single one of those games. On top of it, has averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format in those last 9 contests against the Kansas City Chiefs. So the expectation is, of course, Austin Ekeler getting back on track. Thus far this season, the Kansas City Chiefs, they're allowing 4.57 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. And even though they have only allowed 2 touchdowns to opposing running backs thus far this season, the expectation is that Austin Ekeler is going to find the end zone. And if it wasn't for the fact that Justin Herbert threw the ball in the flat a little late yesterday, we would have ended up seeing Austin Ekeler finding himself in the end zone and, of course, double-digit fantasy points for our teams. Moving on, let's talk about our number 2, Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker is on a 4-game streak of scoring a touchdown. In fact, in the last 4 games, he has scored a total of 6 rushing touchdowns, an incredible streak, and now has an opportunity of extending that streak going up against the Arizona Cardinals. The Arizona Cardinals thus far this season are the 5th best matchup at the running back position. They are allowing 16.23 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, a 4.59 yard per carry average. When you go ahead and take into account last season's games against the Arizona Cardinals, Kenneth Walker in those 2 contests, week 6 of last year, 21 carries, 97 yards, a rushing touchdown, 18 fantasy points. In week 9's contest against the Arizona Cardinals, 26 rushing attempts, 109, 2 rushing touchdowns, 26.4 fantasy points. He has had himself a fair share of success against his division rival. And of course, a lot of other teams have this season already. The LA Rams, 27 carries for 177 and a touchdown. San Francisco 49ers, 25 carries, 119 and 3 touchdowns. Dallas Cowboys, 28 carries for 152. And even the New York Giants in a game in which they threw for majority of the second half. Saquon Barkley and the efforts of those running backs combined for 18 rushing attempts, 68 rushing yards, and of course, 1 rushing touchdown in week 2. Nonetheless, a lot of opportunity on board for Kenneth Walker to have himself another incredible game. Number 3 is Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert is doing something that is incredibly special. In the absence of Devon Etienne, had himself a 3-touchdown game, 2 on the ground, 1 through the air, had himself another game of over 100 rushing yards, and he continues to pile up statistics every single week. 32.7 fantasy points, an unbelievable performance, but again, was going up against the easiest matchup at the position. Now going into this week, he takes on the Philadelphia Eagles. Luckily for Raheem Mostert, he's associated with the highest scoring offense in the National Football League, and he has already scored 11 touchdowns thus far this season in just 6 games. When you compare that to Raheem Mostert from 2019 through 2022, throughout those 4 seasons, Raheem Mostert had 18 total touchdowns. Thus far this season, again, 11 already. He is on a record-setting pace, and hopefully he's just going to continue to accumulate touchdowns. And even in a difficult matchup, hopefully he's going to continue to score a high volume of fantasy points. The Eagles thus far this season are only allowing 6.92 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. We know that Breece Hall found himself in the end zone last week, considering the fact that the Philadelphia Eagles defense said, go ahead and score. Let's give our offense a chance to go ahead and win the game for us. Either way, going into this upcoming week with a difficult matchup on hand, I understand that running backs like Breece Hall only had 39 rushing yards, Kyren Williams with 53, Brian Robinson with 45, Rachaad White with 38, Alexander Mattison with 28, Rhamondre Stevenson with 25. Running backs have not found a lot of success running the ball against this team. But nonetheless, considering the receiving upside, the touchdown upside that Raheem Mostert presents, he is a must start within this offense. Number 4 is Travis Etienne, another running back that is taking on a very difficult matchup. He takes on the New Orleans Saints on Thursday Night Football. The entire conversation regarding the Jacksonville Jaguars currently is whether or not Trevor Lawrence is going to be available for the game. The hope is that he will be. He is trending in a direction in which he will be available. And if that's going to be the case and he's going to be a little bit less mobile due to the injury that he sustained in week 6, they're going to potentially lean upon the running game that much more. Amongst all running backs in the National Football League, Travis Etienne is number 1 amongst all with 113 rushing attempts. He's number 7 amongst all running backs in total receptions. Amongst all players, has the most touches at the running back position. And as long as he continues to get even more opportunity, of course, more fantasy points are going to accumulate for someone like Travis Etienne. Taking on the Saints, who are only allowing 3.57 yards per carry and 6.9 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, the second most difficult matchup at the position. The expectation is that Travis Etienne may struggle in certain circumstances, especially considering the Saints haven't even allowed a single touchdown to an opposing running back this season. Those are statistics that obviously scare us, but ultimately this last week, the Houston Texans running backs, they accumulated over 100 rushing yards. So why not the Jacksonville Jaguars offense, who are humming and of course running the ball successfully with Travis Etienne. Moving on to our number 5, we have Josh Jacobs. They take on the Chicago Bears. There could be a very high likelihood that this is 2 backup quarterbacks taking on each other within the given matchup. And if that's going to be the case, of course, both these teams are going to lean upon the running game. And just like we talked about with Travis Etienne, another running back that is getting a lot of touches thus far this season is Josh Jacobs. In 5 out of the last 6 games he has played, he has had 20 or more touches. So as long as they continue to lean upon Josh Jacobs, he's going to be fantasy relevant, whether it's on the ground or through the air. They do take on the Chicago Bears this week, and the Chicago Bears have been pretty good in terms of stopping the run over the course of the last 3 games. Against Minnesota, only allowed 52 rushing yards to opposing running backs. Against Washington, only 10 rushing yards. And against Denver, only 84 rushing yards. There's certainly a conversation to be had in regards to this defense improving over the course of the season. But as we've seen, week over week, Josh Jacobs' rushing yards continues to increase every single week as he improves and gets more comfortable within this offense. Moving on to our number 6, we have DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift has played extremely well. But what he has done in the last 3 games that has made him extremely special for fantasy purposes is receptions and targets. This is specifically something that we did not expect DeAndre Swift to be incorporated within going into this upcoming season, primarily because this offense was not throwing the ball to their running backs heavily last year. But now that you have someone of the caliber of DeAndre Swift available, of course, you want to throw him the ball as much as you possibly can and get him incorporated, especially when he's coming off of a game in which he had only 18 rushing yards on 10 rushing attempts against the New York Jets. Luckily, in the last 3 games, 20 targets, 18 receptions, 101 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. They take on the Miami Dolphins. If you want to succeed against the Miami Dolphins, you do exactly what the Carolina Panthers did in the first quarter of this last game. You run the ball down their throat. And considering the elite nature of this offensive line for the Philadelphia Eagles, I know they're dealing with a couple injuries on the right side of their offensive line, but if you can get back Lane Johnson for this upcoming week, DeAndre Swift is going to eat against this defense. It's the 9th best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 4.2 yards per carry and nearly 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Again, most recently, the Carolina Panthers running backs, 24 rushing attempts for 106 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown. Buffalo Bills running backs, 22 for 90 and a rushing touchdown. And the New England Patriots running backs, 20 carries for 63 and a touchdown. There's a lot of upside to be had here. Hopefully DeAndre Swift is ready for the task on hand to run the ball probably somewhere near 18 to 20 times in order to keep the ball out of the Miami Dolphins offense hands. Number 7 is Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley looked nice on Sunday Night Football. We did not expect him to continue to get a high volume of touches, especially considering it was the first week back from his ankle injury, but they gave him a premier workload. A total of 24 rushing attempts and 4 receptions, 28 touches on 29 opportunities. We will take that. All with the starting left tackle out. The Giants' backup left tackle also left the game due to an injury. The starting center was out and Daniel Jones was out. All that taken into account, they still were able to put up a great performance. They take on the Washington Commanders this week. Last season, in the 2 games against the Washington Commanders, Saquon Barkley, 16.6 and 20.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Most recently, the Washington Commanders, they've given up their fair share of statistics to opposing running backs. Buffalo ran for 128 and a touchdown. Philadelphia, 70 and a touchdown. Chicago ran for 121 against this defense. Most recently, Atlanta Falcons, 89 rushing yards against this defense. Saquon Barkley, as soon as he gets more incorporation within the receiving game, will have that much more upside, especially with a healthy offensive line returning in week 7. Moving on to our number 8, we have Aaron Jones. Speaking of returning from an injury, hopefully Aaron Jones taking that Monday Night Football game against the Las Vegas Raiders off, and then of course having this bye week is subsequently going to get him into a position where he's healthy and ready to go. I know that earlier today, the Green Bay Packers signed James Robinson. That is concerning if in fact that is because Aaron Jones has not progressed from this hamstring injury. If that's the case, of course, sound the alarm, get A.J. Dillon ready, but rankings are subject to change. But either way, hopefully Aaron Jones is healthy, and especially going up against the Denver Broncos, one of the easiest matchups at the position. The Denver Broncos are the easiest matchup going into this week, considering the Carolina Panthers are not playing. This defense is allowing 5.93 yards per carry on average and nearly 23 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics to opposing running backs per game. The Kansas City Chiefs only had 69 rushing yards, but when you go to the New York Jets game, 208 rushing yards and rushing touchdowns from their running backs. Of course, Chicago Bears, 116 rushing yards. Miami Dolphins, of course, we all know that 351-yard game with 5 rushing touchdowns. But it hasn't just been then. There's also been games against the Washington Commanders in which, of course, the Denver Broncos gave up 96 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs. There is an expectation for Aaron Jones, if healthy, to be an absolute monster play within the given week. Number 9 is Alvin Kamara. Again, he takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars on a short week Thursday Night Football. Very similar to a DeAndre Swift this season. In the last 3 games, seeing a high volume of opportunity within the receiving game. And of course, for Alvin Kamara, that is expected based on the offense and the way that they approach with Kamara. And if it's in the receiving game, you might as well get him as many touches as possible, considering how dynamic he has been. Last week, he had himself 8 targets, 7 catches, 36 yards. In the last 3 games, 25 targets, 23 receptions, 86 receiving yards. That volume of opportunity, of touches, is certainly going to play a factor, especially within this upcoming matchup. The Jacksonville Jaguars are only allowing 3.44 yards per attempt. They're the 5th most difficult matchup at the position, and certainly it's going to play a factor as to the upside of Alvin Kamara going into the given week. Luckily, the Jacksonville Jaguars thus far this season, they are allowing 6.5 receptions per game to opposing running backs, primarily because this defense has played extremely well against the run. And considering you have a running back like Alvin Kamara and a quarterback like Derek Carr that is, of course, wanting to get him incorporated within the receiving game as much as possible, the expectation is high upside, especially considering we're coming off of a game here where the Indianapolis Colts running backs had 13 targets and 11 receptions for 84 receiving yards. I'd love to see a stat line like that from Alvin Kamara on Thursday Night Football. Number 10 is Bijan Robinson. Unfortunately, Bijan Robinson, despite being extremely effective thus far this season and averaging 5 yards per carry as a rookie within this offense, amongst all running backs with a minimum of 60 rushing attempts, he is one of only 3 that has yet to score a rushing touchdown. Again, amongst all running backs, it's Bijan Robinson, Alexander Mattison, and Najee Harris who have 60 or more rushing attempts without a rushing touchdown. Hopefully, going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we can find him scoring a touchdown and increasing his overall upside for fantasy purposes, because we know he's going to get the rushing opportunity. We know he's going to get the receiving work coming off of a game of 5 catches on 8 targets, 43 receiving yards. He's playing the vast majority of the offensive snaps, yet still not finding the end zone makes a huge difference within this overall play. Going into the week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, all I can look towards is the past success that the Atlanta Falcons offense and Arthur Smith has found against this defense. Last season in week 5, his running backs had 90 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. In week 18 against this defense, his running backs had 33 rushing attempts for 165 and a rushing touchdown. Hopefully, we're going to find ourselves a successful week here for Bijan Robinson and, of course, a boatload of opportunity. Number 11 is Brian Robinson Jr. We go from Bijan Robinson to Brian Robinson. Don't get confused. So here's the thing. Brian Robinson takes on a division rival. They take on the New York Giants. It's one of the easiest matchups on hand, considering it is actually the 3rd best matchup at the position, as they're allowing over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs and 5.15 yards per carry thus far this season. When we look at running backs that have played against the New York Giants, Buffalo Bills running backs, 117 rushing yards. Miami Dolphins, 216 and 2 touchdowns. Seattle, 110 and a touchdown. San Francisco, 138 and a touchdown. Arizona, 110 and a touchdown. Dallas, 102 and 2 touchdowns. Many running backs have found themselves incredible levels of success against this defense. So why not Brian Robinson Jr.? Last season in the matchups against the New York Giants, in both those games, put up 12.1 fantasy points and 11.2 fantasy points. The expectation with a great matchup, incredible opportunity within this backfield, and of course, getting himself more and more incorporation near the red zone, of course, in the receiving game, having scored his 2nd receiving touchdown this last week. The sky's the limit in terms of his potential going into the week. Number 12 to close out the RB1 conversation is Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco in the last 5 games has had 17 plus touches in each of those contests. He is playing the vast majority of the overall snaps within this offense, and as long as they continue to give him a high workload of opportunity, by all means, he is a top 12 player considering the association with the Kansas City Chiefs offense. Now, even though the Chiefs are not coming off of a great week, they were quite underwhelming, and they didn't allow Isiah Pacheco to find the end zone, which he had done successfully the 3 prior games to the Denver Broncos game in week 6. he did end up finding himself 6 targets, 6 receptions, and 36 receiving yards. His incorporation within the receiving game thus far this season has been incredible and is only going to continue to lift his overall potential of play. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the LA Chargers, again, if we rewind to last year, Andy Reid has himself a lot of comfortability against this defense and has found himself a lot of success, especially with Isiah Pacheco. Last season, week 11, 107 rushing yards on 15 rushing attempts. There is an expectation is that Andy Reid, he's taken on Brandon Staley's defense so often that he already knows what he's going to scheme up and how much success he's going to potentially find within the upcoming matchup, helping Isiah Pacheco once again be in the RB1 conversation within a given week. Number 13 is Rhamondre Stevenson. We have found life. Rhamondre Stevenson is finally back. He found himself in the end zone, scored 15.5 fantasy points, and I was telling you guys, you just got to believe. Eventually, the New England Patriots are going to get their stuff together, and luckily they were able to do so this last week against the Las Vegas Raiders. Now they have an opportunity to once again prove that they have upside on the horizon for Rhamondre Stevenson, primarily because they take on the Buffalo Bills. Now, a couple things that I wanted to mention in regards to the game against the Las Vegas Raiders. In that game, Rhamondre Stevenson at one point left in order to get reviewed for concussion protocol symptoms, just in case. In his absence, Ezekiel Elliott found the end zone. If Rhamondre Stevenson wasn't in the blue tent, Rhamondre would have had himself a second touchdown within this game. 10 carries for 46 rushing yards, 5 receptions on 6 targets. The biggest difference maker right there. Where Rhamondre Stevenson did most last season that really separated him from the running back position is incorporation within the receiving game. 6 targets, 5 catches, 24 receiving yards. That is a huge difference maker. Taking on the Buffalo Bills, again, without Matt Milano, this defense has definitely struggled in terms of stopping the run. And even with Matt Milano, this has been their biggest weakness over the last couple years. Thus far this season, the Buffalo Bills are the 10th best matchup at the running back position. They are allowing 5.2 yards per carry to opposing running backs. The New York Giants running backs combined for 108 rushing yards. Jacksonville Jaguars running backs, 144 and 2 touchdowns. Miami Dolphins running backs, 110 and 2 touchdowns. Without Matt Milano within the center of this defense, the expectation is that Rhamondre Stevenson should continue his successful streak against the Buffalo Bills, scoring 10 plus fantasy points in each of the last 2 games against this defense back in 2022. Even though Zeke may get himself more and more opportunity considering he has looked great, Rhamondre still in this top tier conversation. Number 14 is James Cook. The unfortunate nature of this backfield is that James Cook doesn't get enough opportunity despite how efficient he has been. When James Cook is finishing a game with 14 rushing attempts for 71 rushing yards, and they're still giving Latavius Murray of all running backs 12 rushing attempts, and they are literally playing the identical volume of offensive snaps, 49% for each of these 2 running backs. It is a disappointment to say the very least. James Cook is a better running back and deserves far more utilization within this backfield. And going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the New England Patriots, they're allowing 12.33 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. In the last 2 games, they've given up their fair share of points to opposing running backs, whether they've been from the Las Vegas Raiders or New Orleans Saints. I'm expecting James Cook to be heavily utilized with the absence of Damian Harris now, and hopefully, maybe, James Cook may have more opportunity near the red zone and the goal line to find himself in the end zone. Number 15 is Jerome Ford. It was a huge surprise to see any sort of success from this offense, and the fact that the Cleveland Browns were able to defeat the San Francisco 49ers, I still can't believe it. But obviously the record of Jim Schwartz, the defensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns, going up against Kyle Shanahan, that continues to stack up in the direction of Jim Schwartz. I think the record for Kyle Shanahan against Jim Schwartz defenses, he's 1-9, if I'm not mistaken. That's pretty ridiculous. And that's probably something we should have kept an eye on last week. But either way, let's go ahead and let's forget last week's game. Let's go into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Indianapolis Colts. They are the 6th best matchup at the position. They're allowing nearly 16 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Most recently, Jacksonville Jaguars running backs, 76 and 2 touchdowns. Tennessee, 77 and a touchdown. LA Rams, 150 and 2 touchdowns. There can be success found here, especially considering how well Jerome Ford has played thus far this season in the absence of Nick Chubb. In this last weekend's game against the San Francisco 49ers, who have a great run-stopping defense, with those 17 rushing attempts that Jerome Ford had, 10 of those 17 rushing attempts were 4 or more yards on these overall carries. Now, many of you may be concerned about the overall usage of Kareem Hunt, but even with that taking place, when you go ahead and break down the overall opportunities, in terms of routes ran, Jerome Ford had more routes run than Kareem Hunt this last week. And additionally, in terms of pass blocking opportunities, they had an identical number. So they're both being utilized within these 3rd down opportunities as a receiving back, as a pass blocking back. And going into the matchup, the expectation is that Jerome Ford could potentially even find the end zone as they continue to lean upon running the ball. Number 16 is Jahmyr Gibbs. In the absence of David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, yes, he has missed each of the last 2 games with a hamstring injury, but my assumption is that he will be healthy and active going into the week. And if he is, Of course, Jahmyr Gibbs, a valuable running back based on the offense that he is incorporated within. And of course, the elite offensive line he plays behind. And even though it's a very difficult matchup against this defense, the Baltimore Ravens, who are only allowing 9.82 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, they're still allowing 4.23 yards per carry on average, which for Jahmyr Gibbs sounds great. As long as David Montgomery's out and we continue to see more opportunity in the direction of Jahmyr Gibbs, you go back to week 3 in the game in which David Montgomery did not play, 17 rushing attempts for 80 rushing yards, 2 targets, 1 reception. There is still a chance for Jahmyr Gibbs to have himself an upside performance within the given week against the Baltimore Ravens. That's what we're hoping for. Hopefully he's healthy and practicing this week. Number 17 is Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor and probably Zach Moss need to be mentioned back-to-back once again, primarily because both of these running backs are now seeing very similar levels of opportunity and snap counts. In week 6, we saw both of these running backs touch the ball 13 times. Of course, Zach Moss accumulated 59 total yards, and Jonathan Taylor accumulated 65 total yards. Even though Zach Moss was given the goal line carry to fall into the end zone and make his fantasy week 14.9 fantasy points, we still saw Jonathan Taylor relevant with 9 total fantasy points, despite very little utilization and upside within his overall rushing work. The fact of the matter is, Gardner Minshew targeted these 2 running backs 13 times for 11 receptions. And if that's going to continue to be the case, especially going up against the difficult matchup of the Cleveland Browns, both these guys for another consecutive week are RB2 options. But eventually, I do believe Jonathan Taylor will break away from Zach Moss within this offense. Moving on to our number 19 and number 20, we have Elijah Mitchell and Jordan Mason. Now, the reason why I have Elijah Mitchell ranked higher is because if, in fact, Christian McCaffrey is not going to play, based on the comments that we've heard from Kyle Shanahan yesterday, the expectation is that Elijah Mitchell will get the first crack at being the starting running back. Let me go ahead and read you guys some quotes from his overall press conference yesterday. Kyle Shanahan said, "Elijah has earned a ton with us over 3 years. Elijah, when he's healthy, has been as good of a back as there is. I also can't take away anything from JP," which he's referring to Jordan Mason. "Every time JP has gotten an opportunity, you guys have seen what he's been able to do. Both these guys have done very well." Then he also continued to say, "Elijah came back to participate late last week on Thursday. He only got in 1 true day of practice, and that's why JP got the first nod once Christian McCaffrey came out." So basically, he's referring to the idea of Elijah Mitchell has done enough over the course of the last 3 years to earn the starting running back position if, in fact, Christian McCaffrey is out. And the only reason he wasn't given the opportunities on Sunday's game against the Cleveland Browns is because he's been dealing with an injury. He returned to practice late last week, and due to that, of course, they leaned in the direction of Jordan Mason, who had far more practice under his belt. Elijah Mitchell, since 2021, since entering the league, in games in which he's given 10 or more touches, he's averaging 13.13 fantasy points per game throughout the regular season. Elijah Mitchell will be the guy that I would lean upon if, in fact, Christian McCaffrey is not playing. But closely behind him, I would expect Jordan Mason to also get himself an ample volume of opportunity within this offense, taking on the Minnesota Vikings this upcoming week if, in fact, Christian McCaffrey is not available to play. Moving on to our number 21, we have Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams last week returned from the injury and looked pretty decent. 10 carries for 52 rushing yards. Didn't get himself any utilization within the receiving game. But the issue with Javonte Williams and why he's only at number 21 primarily has to do with the fact that this is a 3-headed monster of a backfield. They're going to continue to utilize a lot of Samaje Perine, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Javonte Williams. And with that being the case, again, Javonte Williams was able to handle 10 of the overall 17 running back rushing attempts from Thursday's game against the Kansas City Chiefs. But that's not enough for me to feel confident about starting him every single week, especially considering he has yet to score a touchdown this season, while Jaleel McLaughlin has scored 3 touchdowns within this backfield, 1 on the ground and 2 through the air. I know it's a very advantageous matchup taking on the Green Bay Packers, the 4th best matchup at the position, a defense that is allowing over 4 yards per carry and over 16 fantasy points per game. Most recently, of course, the Las Vegas Raiders running back 73 and a touchdown, Chicago running back 63 and a touchdown, New Orleans Saints 65 rushing yards. Of course, Detroit Lions running backs 161 and 3 touchdowns. There have been a lot of successful performances against the Green Bay Packers defense. We're hoping for Javonte Williams to get more of an expansion of opportunity within this offense. Moving on, we have our number 22, Zach Evans. The expectation is that Kyren Williams is going to miss this upcoming week, while Ronnie Rivers is expected to miss 4 to 6 games. With that all being taken into account, we have to understand that Zach Evans is a rookie running back. He is a 6th round selection out of Ole Miss. If, in fact, we're going to be in a conversation of giving him the bulk majority of carries, I know that they're going to elevate Royce Freeman going into the week, and Royce Freeman has more experience throughout his entire NFL career. It is very difficult to predict what, Sean McVay wants to do. Sean McVay, prior to the season, we all thought, okay, Cam Akers is going to be the guy, and then it wasn't. We're all expecting that Zach Evans is going to be the guy this week, while, Royce Freeman has been a practice squad guy, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see more Royce Freeman than you potentially expect. Nonetheless, we got to take into account the fact that the Rams running backs this season have accumulated 136 rushing attempts, 552 rushing yards, and 7 rushing touchdowns in just 6 games. With that level of opportunity and potential red zone opportunity, Zach Evans is a value, and even against the Pittsburgh Steelers, my expectation is that he should be fantasy relevant and, of course, picked up off the waivers. Number 23 is Roschon Johnson. Again, he did miss last week due to the concussion protocol. Every single player that has been, designated with a concussion usually misses at least 1 week thus far this season. That has been the base minimum and the average. Now, going into the future, again, he should be ready to go. And if, in fact, Justin Fields is not going to be prepared and his thumb is going to be an issue, we're going to have 2 backup quarterbacks potentially going up against each other, as Jimmy Garoppolo also sustained an injury and left the game against the New England Patriots. Thus far this season, Roschon Johnson is averaging 4.88 yards per carry. And even with the incorporation of D'Onta Foreman within his backfield, the expectation going up against the 8th best matchup at the position, allowing over 4.32 yards per carry on average, is that Roschon Johnson should be the primary back. If they're going to continue to lean upon the running game that much more due to the absence of Justin Fields, the expectation is that Roschon Johnson on the ground through the air as the preferred third down back and receiving back of this offense should see himself a lot of opportunity within the given week in an advantageous matchup. We'll talk about D'Onta Foreman in a moment, but at this current moment in time, Roschon Johnson is preferred out of the 2. Moving on, let's talk about our number 24, Rachaad White. Rachaad White's coming off a very disappointing performance, which we expected. Whenever you take on the Detroit Lions, no running back is really going to find a high level of success. But luckily, Rachaad White for another consecutive week, getting himself utilization within the receiving game, and for full PPR purposes, still somewhat relevant. In a half PPR, not so much. But I'll leave him at the back end of the RB2 conversation because of the following. First and foremost, he's only averaging 3.31 yards per carry on average. He has had one of the most difficult schedules at the running back position, taking on Minnesota, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Detroit thus far this season. Again, very difficult strings of games. And now he has to take on the Atlanta Falcons, who have been very much so improved in terms of stopping the run. Thus far this season, they're only allowing 3.85 yards per carry. In 4 out of the last 5 games, the Atlanta Falcons have allowed less than 70 rushing yards to opposing running backs. So the expectation is not a lot of overall upside in terms of rushing yards, but hopefully receiving work, rushing touchdown, that could be in the realm of possibility for Rachaad White this week. 25, we have Alexander Mattison. They take on the San Francisco 49ers. I am deathly afraid of that defense, especially when we talk about Kirk Cousins, primetime Monday Night Football. Man, that does scare me. Either way, Alexander Mattison is being given opportunity. There's no lack of opportunity. He's certainly getting it. Last week, had himself 7 targets, 4 receptions, 18 rushing attempts. 25 opportunities and 22 touches is no joke, but he only scored 9.2 fantasy points because the offense as a whole struggled against the Chicago Bears defense. Thus far this season, in 5 out of the last 6 games, Alexander Mattison has put up 9 or more fantasy points, which is great. He's consistent in that regard, but that's where I expect him to land, 9 fantasy points, and that's why I have him in RB25. Going into the week, the expectation against the matchup, with how bad his offensive line has played, despite the fact that all of his offensive linemen have extremely high grades, according to Pro Football Focus, this team does not run the ball very effectively. Nonetheless, the expectation is that Alexander Mattison will be playable, but I'm not hanging my hat on the idea of him scoring a touchdown or being super relevant within the running game this week. Number 26, we have Kareem Hunt. Now, Kareem Hunt getting himself more utilization with his backfield. Again, it has taken a couple weeks for him to get there, primarily because they pulled him right off the couch and into the game just a couple weeks ago. Now, Kareem Hunt getting used to it this last week, had himself 15 total touches, 12 on the ground, 3 through the air. And as long as he's going to play 50% of the offensive snaps within this offense, of course, this team is going to lean upon the running game. They have an advantageous matchup against the 6th best matchup of the position, taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Like I mentioned earlier with Jerome Ford, Jacksonville's running backs, Tennessee's running backs, LA Rams running backs, all 3 of those teams took advantage of the running game against the Indianapolis Colts. The expectation with Watson out for another consecutive week would be that Kareem Hunt should absolutely be fantasy relevant as an RB3 with upside within the given week. Number 27 is Jayen Warren. Thus far this season, in 3 out of the last 4 games, Jayen Warren has put up 8.5 plus fantasy points. Additionally, in the last 4 games, he has played 10 plus touches. He is ranked in those 4 games RB21, RB31, RB23, and RB25. The expectation, again, is the average of that bunch. And with, Najee Harris really not playing well and potentially in a negative game script this upcoming weekend against the LA Rams, Jayen Warren, more receiving work within this offense is expected. And going forward, with his effectiveness in the running game, should be more relevant. Number 28. Oh, speaking of Najee Harris, we have 28. Najee Harris takes on the LA Rams. Thus far this season, Najee Harris is only averaging 3.92 yards per carry on average. Luckily for him, the LA Rams are allowing 4.22 yards per carry thus far this season to opposing running backs. But the primary reason Najee Harris has been terrible is his offensive line purely. Yards before contact per attempt amongst all running backs in the National Football League, Najee Harris is ranked 46th, 1.9 yards before contact per attempt. More often than not, Najee Harris has a defender in his face as soon as he is handed off the ball. The volume of penetration that we have seen from front seven defenses against the Pittsburgh Steelers offense is ridiculous. And Najee Harris is obviously suffering for fantasy purposes due to this. We talked about it earlier with Bijan Robinson. Amongst all the running backs thus far this season who have had 60 or more rushing attempts, only 3 have yet to score a touchdown. Bijan, Alexander Mattison, and of course, Najee Harris. Not a surprise. But in terms of yards before contact per attempt, he's ranked 47 above guys like Miles Sanders, Josh Jacobs, Damian Pierce, Rhamondre Stevenson, and Barkley. You can see why these running backs are struggling. It's not because they aren't playing well. It's because their offensive lines are awful. Number 29, we have Keaontay Ingram. Keaontay Ingram is the starting running back of this team. That's the expectation as he saw the vast majority of touches within this offense. 50% of the overall running back rushing attempts, and of course, 50% of the overall running back targets. If we're going to continue to see him be the primary back in a game against the Seattle Seahawks, in which I do expect, of course, a lot of upside from that offense from Seattle to pour it on against the Arizona Cardinals defense, we should see a negative game script and hopefully more Keaontay Ingram receptions out of this backfield. Number 30, we have D'Onta Foreman. D'Onta Foreman did not provide as much fantasy upside as I anticipated. But let me go ahead and just, for those of you who didn't watch the game, understand what happened in that game. In the fourth quarter, the Chicago Bears with a backup quarterback went down the field, and with a nice 7-yard rushing attempt, D'Onta Foreman gets tackled down at the 1-yard line. The following play, they run a quarterback push in which they motion Cole Kmet right behind the quarterback, and they push him right into the end zone. That should have been a rushing touchdown for D'Onta Foreman. He should have had himself double-digit fantasy points and should have taken his 7.2 fantasy point week and gotten himself at least 13-plus fantasy points. Unfortunately, that wasn't a part of the script for that offense, and nonetheless, we're going to have to live with the decision I made. Going into this upcoming week against the Las Vegas Raiders, I do expect Roschon Johnson to be the primary back, but outside of that, we have seen enough efficiency from D'Onta Foreman throughout his career to know that he is going to be incorporated within this offense, just like Darrington Evans was in association with D'Onta Foreman. I mean, just look at his overall rushing attempts based on the next-gen stats that you guys can see on the top right of the screen. A lot of green there. D'Onta Foreman played well, and he'll continue in week 7. Moving on to our number 31, we have Jaleel McLaughlin. Considering he's still playing 40% of the snaps, getting himself receiving upside and a handful of rushing attempts, again, between Javonte, Samaje, and Jaleel, it's basically just Jaleel McLaughlin and, of course, Javonte Williams who get rushing attempts. So the expectation is that if he's going to continue to get rushing attempts, be the red zone goal line back, and also get himself a lot of receiving upside within the matchup against the Green Bay Packers, the 4th best matchup at the position, Jaleel McLaughlin should absolutely be relevant for fantasy purposes within this 3-headed monster of a backfield. Moving on to our number 32, Tyler Allgeier. Tyler Allgeier gets himself a high volume of opportunity, just doesn't do much with it thus far this season, has been far less efficient, and because of that, Tyler Allgeier is not as dependable as we would like him to be. They do take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and last season in the 2 games against that defense, the running backs for the Atlanta Falcons accumulated 17 fantasy points in Week 5's matchup and 23.6 fantasy points in Week 18's matchup. The hope is that Tyler Allgeier could be somewhat efficient and have himself the upside of a touchdown, but it's not always in the realm of possibility. Moving on to our number 33, Ezekiel Elliott. Against the Las Vegas Raiders, Zeke actually looked good. I mean, he even had a huge touchdown called back in which it gave me kind of reminiscent vibes of Zeke back in the day when he was healthy, he had his knees, and he was with the Dallas Cowboys. And, now that I'm thinking about it, looking at Monday night's game from yesterday, maybe the Cowboys do miss Zeke a little bit. I mean, Tony Pollard's not really getting anything done in the running game. They're really just tossing him up the middle and hoping that he doesn't get smashed, and he is anyway, regardless of how good that offensive line is. Nonetheless, when we're talking about Zeke, he's going to get himself more and more utilization, found himself in the end zone, and as long as he continues to get himself a volume of opportunity within this offense, in a matchup which is advantageous in terms of running the ball, I'm expecting for the New England Patriots to run the ball for majority of the game against the Buffalo Bills, keep the ball out of course, Josh Allen's hands, and dominate the time of possession. Number 34 is Gus Edwards. As much as I like Gus Edwards, the fact of the matter is, regardless of the fact that he had 17 total touches and 62% of the overall opportunities, taking on the Tennessee Titans defense was not easy. And he only put up 5.8 fantasy points. Now he takes on the most difficult matchup at the position against the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions against running backs: Rachaad White, 26 rushing yards. Sanders and Hubbard combined for 67. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, 29. Bijan Robinson with 33. Kenneth Walker with 43. Isiah Pacheco with 23. I don't expect much out of Gus Edwards. Even with less utilization from Justice Hill, Gus Edwards is very much so a sketchy back to play this given week. Moving on to our number 35, we have Latavius Murray. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these running backs are not going to be guys that we're excited about starting, but they are given opportunity nonetheless. Latavius Murray's coming off of a week in which he had 12 rushing attempts. With Damian Harris out with a neck injury, Latavius Murray is going to get himself more opportunity, especially in a game script in which, if in fact the Buffalo Bills take a commanding lead, they'll be running out the clock in the second half. The final running back I wanted to mention to conclude today's video is Craig Reynolds. If in fact Jahmyr Gibbs is not available to play and that hamstring injury is going to hold him out for another consecutive week, Craig Reynolds will be of value and relevancy for fantasy purposes. Again, within that offense, behind that incredible offensive line, despite how inefficient Craig Reynolds was in the Tampa Bay matchup, I do expect that he will be a top 24-esque running back if, in fact, we're in a conversation where Jahmyr Gibbs is out, David Montgomery's out, Zonovan Knight's out. There's nobody else but to give the ball to Craig Reynolds in a fantastic offense. That'll go ahead and conclude my top 36 running back rankings for Week 7 of the 2023 fantasy football season. Reminder, if you guys have not yet already, subscribe, click the like button down below. Again, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew to get my rankings. For those of you who want additional rankings, perhaps have already used my code in the past, already, this season, or potentially in seasons past with somebody else's code, etc., you can go ahead and also check out the Patreon. Unlimited questions answered there. I have my rankings every single Thursday and Sunday. So if you're interested, check that out. Thank you everybody for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the wide receiver conversation. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.